Hello, everybody. Peter Marivel's here. Welcome to session 3 of our day-long event titled Deconstructing Oligarchy, How Wealthy Elites Undermine Democracy and Our Survival on the Planet. We continue our deep dive into the methods and philosophy of the ultra-rich and how they have come to adversely affect our lives and the survival of life on this sphere. We'll be exploring how we can change the political and social paradigm and offer meaningful resistance in the service of a more equitable, just, and sustainable model of living. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. I would like to take this moment to honor those who have come before us as stewards of the land with an offering of respect. So our next session will be chaired by Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser is a Henry and Louis A. Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research. She is the author of Fortunes of Feminism and The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born, and co-author of Capitalism, A Conversation and Feminism for the 99%. Her writing has appeared in the New Left Review, Dissent Magazine, and The Guardian UK. The subject of her talk today is her new book titled Cannibal, Capitalism, How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, and What We Can Do About It. It's published by our friends over at Verso Books. In this installment of our program, we will explore how the structure of capitalism lends itself and supports expressions of greed and self-destruction that we see emerging all around us. She will offer us alternative ways of thinking about our predicament and encourage a meaningful and effective resistance. So please join us now in welcoming Nancy Fraser. So good to have you with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be here, and hi to everybody who's here listening and watching this. Yeah, so my new book is, as Peter just said, called Cannibal, Capitalism, and I thought the best way to introduce it was to actually start with the COVID pandemic, because I won't be speaking so much about the ultra-rich as about capital. I'm going to try to give a structural argument as to why the COVID pandemic turned out so much worse than it might have. And I'm sure you've heard that COVID-19 has served as a perverse diagnosis. Lots of people have said that it has lit up all the fault lines in our society, especially the fault lines of gender and color, nation and class. And that's completely true. But I want to suggest that we do not hear enough about the social system that generates those fault lines, even though, I'll argue, it's the same social system that brought us the virus in the first place and has blocked our efforts to deal with it. So I want to, in a sense, stop tiptoeing around and, as it were, cut to the chase. What the pandemic diagnosis actually, in my view, is the deep-seated dysfunctionality of capitalism as a social system. Now, I think that COVID is a kind of perfect storm of capitalist irrationality and injustice. And using my cannibalism metaphor, I would say it's a perfect orgy of cannibal capitalism. More than anything in recent memory, the pandemic discloses the system's multiple contradictions: ecological, political, social, and economic. All of these contradictions are baked into a social order that incentivizes a profit-hungry class of owners to devour the essential conditions of their own existence and, what's worse, of our existence. It incentivizes them to guzzle care work, to scarf up nature, to eviscerate public power, to wolf down the wealth of racialized populations, and to suck dry the energy and creativity of all working people. You can see I'm really running with this cannibalism metaphor. I think it's more than a metaphor, as I'll explain in a minute. Now, those things that I just mentioned, care work, nature, public power, the wealth of racialized populations, these things are essential conditions of production and accumulation in a capitalist society, as well as of life on the planet. And that's the rub. Capitalist society is structured in a way that begs the profit maker to gobble them up for the sake of fattening their profits, for raising their share prices, even as it also absolves them of any obligation to replenish what they take or to repair what they damage. And so the effect is not only to leave a trail of wreckage across the globe, but also periodically to destabilize the entire jerry-built edifice of capitalist society. Now, those are all propositions that I'm going to give you some arguments for in just a minute. But I want to say that COVID offers, in my view, a textbook demonstration of that idea. The pandemic is an orgy where all of capitalism's contradictions converge, where its cannibalization of nature, care work, and political capacities of peripheralized populations and working classes merge in a lethal binge. We cannot properly understand the pandemic without a proper understanding of capitalism, an understanding of it as a cannibal. Let me explain. The word cannibalism has several meanings. The most familiar and the most concrete, the one that probably occurs first to you, is the ritual eating of human flesh by a human being. Now, that usage is burdened by a very long racist history, as you know, because the term was applied by a kind of inverted logic to Black Africans who were on the receiving end of Euro-imperial predation. So I take a certain satisfaction in turning the tables and invoking the term here as a descriptor for the capitalist class, a group I want to show that feeds off of everyone else. But the term cannibalism also has a more abstract meaning, which captures a deeper truth about our society. The verb to cannibalize means to deprive one facility or enterprise of an essential element of its functioning for the purpose of creating or sustaining another one. That, I want to show, is a fair approximation of the relation of capitalism's economy to its non-economic precincts, that is, to the families and communities, habitats and ecosystems, state capacities and public powers, whose substance its economy consumes in order to engorge itself. There's also a specialized astronomical meaning of cannibalism. A celestial object is said to cannibalize another such object when it incorporates mass from the latter through gravitational attraction. That, I want to suggest too, is an apt characterization of the process by which capital draws into its orbit natural and social wealth from peripheral zones of the world system. And there is finally the Ouroboros. That's the self-cannibalizing serpent that eats its own tail, which happens to be depicted on my book's cover. That's a fitting image, I claim, for a system that's wired to devour the social, political, and natural bases of its own existence, which, as I just said, are also the bases of ours. In general, then, the cannibal metaphor offers several promising avenues for an analysis of capitalist society. It invites us to see that society as an institutionalized feeding frenzy in which the main course is us. However, the term capitalism, too, cries out for clarification. Our received understandings focus too single-mindedly on the system's official economy. They identify the core injustice of capitalist society with the exploitation of free-waged workers at the point of commodity production. And they designate the system's defining irrationality as its tendency to precipitate economic crises. Now, these identifications are not so much wrong as incomplete. Capitalist societies do indeed generate class exploitation and economic crises as a function of their structural dynamics. But they also give rise to additional injustices and irrationalities, which are equally structural and equally serious, but fail to appear on the radar screen of received understandings. These extra economic defects of capitalist society are deeply implicated in the present crisis, the COVID crisis. If we hope to interpret the latter correctly and to figure out how to overcome it, we need to develop a new expanded conception of capitalism that foregrounds not just the system's economy, but the relation of its economy to its non-economic conditions of possibility. Let me explain that by mentioning 4 such non-economic conditions of possibility for a capitalist economy. The first is social reproduction, or as it's often called more informally, care work. Included here are all the activities that create, socialize, nurture, sustain, and replenish the human beings who occupy positions in the economy. You can't have a capitalist economy without workers who produce commodities under the aegis of for-profit enterprises. And you can't have them without caregivers who reproduce human beings in settings external to the official economy. Care work clearly involves gestation, birthing, nursing, feeding, bathing, socializing, educating, healing, protecting, solacing. In short, everything essential to sustaining beings, human beings, who are at once biological and social. Now, historically, much, though not all of this work has been unwaged and performed by women, often in private households, but also in communities, neighborhoods, and villages, in civil society associations, public sector agencies, and increasingly nowadays, even in for-profit firms, such as private schools and for-profit nursing homes. But wherever it's done, social reproduction is an indispensable precondition for the production of commodities, for making profit, for accumulating capital. And yet, capital goes to very great lengths to avoid paying for care work, or failing that, to pay as little as possible for it. And that's a setup for trouble, because capitalist societies incentivize business to free ride on care work with no obligation to replenish it. They entrench a deep-seated tendency to social reproductive crisis. In other words, they tend to cannibalize care work. And of course, that means at the same time, they entrench a gender order that subordinates women. Now, a second precondition for a capitalist economy is ecological. Just as a capitalist economy depends on care work, so too it presupposes the availability of energy to power production, of material substrates, including so-called raw materials for labor to transform, and of sinks for absorbing production's waste. Capital relies, in short, on nature, in the sense, first, of specific substances inputted directly into production, and second, general environmental conditions, such as breathable air, potable water, fertile soil, relatively stable sea levels, and a habitable climate. And there again is the rub. By its very design, capitalist society incentivizes the owners to treat nature as a bottomless trove of non-economic treasure, there for the taking and infinitely self-regenerating, hence not needing replenishment or repair, which is, of course, clearly false. This, too, we are finally beginning to realize is a recipe for disaster. Capitalist societies institutionalize a structural tendency to ecological crisis, a tendency to cannibalize nature, as well as profound disparities in vulnerability to the ensuing fallout. Now, those disparities point to a third condition of possibility for capital accumulation, and that is wealth commandeered from subject populations. Almost always racialized, such populations are designated for expropriation as opposed to exploitation. They've been deprived of state protections and actionable rights, so their land and labor can be taken without remuneration and funneled into the circuits of accumulation. Expropriation is often seen as an early superseded feature of a system that piles up wealth really by exploiting free workers in factories, but that's a mistake. Capitalist production would not be profitable without an ongoing stream of cheap inputs, including natural resources and unfree or dependent labor that's been confiscated from populations who've been subjected through conquest, enslavement, unequal exchange, incarceration, or predatory debt, populations, therefore, that are unable to fight back. It's been said that behind Manchester stood Mississippi, meaning that slave labor supplied the cheap raw cotton that fed the iconic textile mills at the dawn of industrialization. But the same is true today. Behind Cupertino stands Kinshasa, where lithium for Tesla's batteries and coltan for Apple's iPhones are mined on the cheap, at times by enslaved Congolese children. We could also say, behind those who shop at Walmart stand those who sew in Dhaka. There are many variations on this imbrication of exploitation and expropriation. Capitalism's economy doesn't work if everyone is paid wages that cover their true reproduction costs, their true costs of living. It doesn't work, in other words, without a global color line that divides populations that are merely exploitable, air quotes, from those that are downright expropriable. And by institutionalizing that division, capitalism also entrenches imperialism and racial oppression. Those are structural, not contingent features of this social system. There is finally a fourth background condition for a capitalist economy, and that is public power. Paradigmatically, but not only, state power. Accumulation cannot proceed without legal systems that guarantee property rights and contractual exchange, nor without repressive forces that manage dissent, put down rebellions, and enforce the status hierarchies that enable corporations to expropriate racialized populations at home and abroad. Neither can the system function without public regulations and public goods, including infrastructures of various kinds, and of course, a stable money supply. Indispensable for accumulation, these things cannot be provided through the market, but only via the exercise of public powers. Capital needs such powers then, but it is also primed to undermine it, to weaken it by evading taxes, weakening regulations, offshoring operations, and capturing public agencies. So the result is a built-in set of tensions between the economic and the political in capitalist societies, a tendency to cannibalize or hollow out public power and a deep-seated tendency to political crisis. On the one hand, crises of governance, in which the system destroys its own capacity to manage the problems it generates, which I think is a fair description of where we are right now. And on the other hand, crises of hegemony, in which masses of people defect from politics as usual, sometimes for potentially emancipatory alternatives, and often for really terrible ones. Now, in all four cases, capitalist societies institute contradictory relations between their economies and the latter's non-economic background conditions of possibility. That contradictory relation is a relation of cannibalization. And the result is a tangle of multiple crisis tendencies, which have now converged, I claim, in a cannibal capitalist orgy. So let's look more closely at COVID now with this framework in mind. I want to start with nature, which is, of course, as I said, the site of the system's ecological contradiction. It was none other than capital's cannibalization of that vital support of its own existence and of ours that exposed humans to SARS-CoV-2 in the first place. Long harbored by bats in remote caves, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 made the zoonotic leap to us in 2019 by way of some yet unidentified bridging species. Possibly some have claimed pangolins. But what brought the bats into contact with that intermediary species and the latter into contact with us is already clear. Namely, the combined effects of global warming on the one hand and tropical deforestation on the other. What is also clear is that both of those processes are progeny of capital, driven by its insatiable hunger for profit. Together, they, that is global warming and tropical deforestation, eviscerated the habitats of innumerable species, triggering mass migrations, creating new proximities among previously distanced but now distressed organisms, and so promoting novel transfers of pathogens among them. Now, even before COVID, that dynamic had already precipitated a string of viral epidemics in this way. AIDS, Nipah, SARS, MERS, Ebola, we can add now monkeypox, and as well as COVID-19. More of these pandemics will come. They are the non-accidental byproducts of a social order that puts nature at the mercy of capital. Incentivized to appropriate biophysical wealth as quickly as and as cheaply as possible, again, with no responsibility for repair or replenishment. Those dedicated to amassing profit decimate rainforests and bombard the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. Hell-bent on accumulation in every era, but massively empowered in our day by neoliberalization, they have let loose an escalating cascade of lethal plagues. Now, COVID's effects on humans would be horrific under any conditions, but they have been made incalculably worse by another strand of capitalist crisis, rooted in another cannibalization dynamic or structural contradiction of capitalist societies, one that has also been sharpened to a fever pitch in the neoliberal era. It is, after all, not just nature that capital has cannibalized in this period, but also, as I said before, public power. That too is an essential ingredient of its diet, avidly consumed in every phase of the system's development, but devoured with special ferocity in the last 40 years. And that's the catch. The political capacities that financialized capital has gorged on are precisely those we could have used to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. But well before the COVID outbreak, Most states bowed to the demands of the markets, which is really the demands of large mega corporations, by slashing social spending, including in public health infrastructure and basic research. With a few exceptions, notably Cuba, they drew down stockpiles of life-saving equipment, gutted diagnostic and tracing capacities, shrank coordination and treatment capacities. Having eviscerated the public infrastructure, moreover, our rulers devolved vital healthcare functions to profit-driven providers and insurers, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturers. These firms, which are constitutionally uninterested in and unconstrained by the public interest, now control the lion's share of the world's health-related resources, the labor forces and raw materials, the machinery and production facilities, the supply chains and intellectual property, the research institutions and personnel, all the things which together determine our fates, individual and collective. Committed to preserving their profit streams, these corporations form a private force majeure that blocks concerted public action on behalf of humanity. The effects are tragic but unsurprising. A social system that subjects matters of life and death to the so-called law of value was structurally primed from the get-go to abandon untold millions to COVID-19. But that's not all. The collapse of already weak public systems converged with another structural contradiction of capitalist society centered on social reproduction. Always a staple of capital's consumption, care work has been voraciously gobbled up by it in recent years. The same regime that divested from public care infrastructure also broke unions and drove down wages, compelling increased hours of paid work per household, including from primary caregivers. In other words, neoliberalism offloaded care work onto families and communities at just the moment when it also commandeered the time, energy, and resources that we needed to perform such care work. And so the effect was to turn capitalism's inherent tendency to cannibalize social reproduction into an acute care crunch. COVID's advent intensified this strand of crisis too, dumping major new care chores on families and communities, especially onto women, who still do the lion's share of unpaid care work. Under lockdown, as you know, childcare and schooling shifted into people's homes, leaving parents to take on that burden on top of others in confined domestic spaces ill-suited to those purposes. Many employed women ended up quitting their jobs to care for kids and other relatives, while many others were laid off by employers. Both groups have faced major losses in position and pay if or when they rejoin the workforce. A third group, privileged to keep their jobs and work remotely from home while also performing care work, including for housebound kids, had to take multitasking to new heights of craziness. A fourth group, not strictly delimited by gender, bore the honorific essential workers, but were paid a pittance and treated as disposable, required to brave the threat of infection daily, along with the fear of bringing it home, in order to produce and distribute the stuff that enabled others to shelter in place. Now, in each of these cases, the work of social reproduction, now swollen by the pandemic, fell and still falls, as I said, largely to women, as it has in every phase of capitalism's history. But which women end up in which category depends on color and class. So let's turn to color. Structural racism infuses every aspect of the current crisis. At the global level, it colors the ecological strand. As capital quenches its thirst for cheap nature, largely by seizing land, energy, and mineral wealth from racialized populations, deprived, as I said before, of political protection and actionable rights. Having been subjected variously to conquest, enslavement, genocide, dispossession by debt, those populations now bear an undue share of the global environmental load. They are disproportionately vulnerable to toxic dumping, so-called natural disasters, and multiple lethal impacts of global warming. And now, of course, they found themselves last in line for vaccines and therapeutics to fight COVID-19. At the national level, meanwhile, race also inflects the political and social reproductive strands of our crisis. As we know, communities of color have been denied access to conditions that promote health, to affordable high-quality medical care, clean water at Jackson, Mississippi at this very moment, nutritious food, safe working and living conditions, etc. No wonder then that their members were disproportionately and are still disproportionately affected and killed by COVID. The reasons are not at all mysterious: poverty and inferior healthcare, pre-existing medical conditions linked to stress, poor nutrition, and exposure to toxins, overrepresentation in frontline jobs that cannot be performed remotely, lack of resources that would permit them to refuse unsafe work, and of labor rights that would permit them to win protections, inferior housing and living arrangements that don't allow for social distancing and that facilitate transmission, diminished access to vaccines and therapeutics. Together, those conditions expanded the meaning of the slogan, Black Lives Matter, synergizing with its original reference to police violence and helping to fuel ongoing protests. Color, of course, is deeply entwined with class in the capitalist world system generally, and in the present period particularly. In fact, the two overlap considerably, as that category essential worker shows. If we leave aside medical professionals, that designation covers migrant farm workers, immigrant meat packing and slaughterhouse workers, Amazon warehouse pickers, UPS drivers, nursing home aides, hospital cleaners, supermarket stockers and cashiers, and gig workers who deliver groceries and take out meals. Especially dangerous in COVID times, these jobs are mostly very low paid, non-unionized and precarious, and do not carry much in the way of benefits or labor protections. They are subject to intrusive supervision and relentless speed up. Although others hold some of them too, these jobs are disproportionately filled by women and people of color. Taken together, these jobs and those who perform them represent the face of the working class in financialized capitalism. No longer epitomized by the figure of the white male miner, factory operative, or construction worker, that class now consists paradigmatically of care workers, gig workers, and low-wage service workers. Paid less than the costs of their reproduction when paid at all, these workers are expropriated as well as exploited. COVID has exposed that dirty secret as well. By juxtaposing the essential character of that class's work to capital's systematic undervaluation of it, the pandemic testifies to another major contradiction of capitalist society, the inability of markets in labor power to reckon the real worth of work. In general, then, COVID is a veritable orgy of capitalist irrationality and injustice. By ratcheting up the system's inherent defects to the breaking point, it shines a piercing beam on all the structural contradictions of our society, dragging them out from the shadows and into the daylight, the pandemic reveals capital's inherent drive to cannibalize nature up to the very brink of planetary conflagration, to divert our capacities away from the truly essential work of social reproduction, to eviscerate public power to the point where it cannot solve the problems the system generates, to feed off the ever-increasing wealth and health of racialized people, to not only exploit, but also expropriate the working class. Truly, we could not ask for a better lesson in social theory. But now comes the hard part, putting that lesson to work in political practice. It's time to figure out how to starve the beast and put an end once and for all to cannibal capitalism. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. And I see that I didn't live up to Peter's promise that I was going to tell you what to do, but I'll be
Well, that comes in the next panel. So,
happy.
Everybody, please come to the next session, which actually starts in 10 minutes. And
Okay.
that's where we get down and dirty. So, ever grateful for this. Thank you so much, Professor Fraser. This event has been brought to you by City Lights in conjunction with W.W. Norton, Pluto Press, and of course, our friends at Verso Books. All City Lights events are made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, into the future through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So really want to thank you all for joining us in this session. We've got one more coming up in just a few minutes. Nancy, I hope to see you there. And everyone, thank you again.